If you've ever tried to learn English, you've definitely felt it. That moment of pure head-scratching frustration where you realize the spelling makes absolutely no sense. You are not alone, I promise. English spelling is famously fantastically weird. But what if I told you there's a method to the madness? That it's not random at all? Let's get into it. You see, what looks like total chaos, it isn't a flaw. It's actually a series of clues. So today, we're going to put on our detective hats, we're going to follow a trail of historical evidence to finally solve the mystery of why English is written the way it is. So let's just ask the big question right up front. Why is this language so tricky? Why do words that look almost identical sound completely different from each other? It's a question that has stumped learners for centuries, and today we're actually going to find the answer. All right, let's start with Exhibit A in our investigation. Here we have 4 words, and they all end with the same 4 letters, O-U-G-H. But, and here's the crazy part, none of them rhyme. This isn't a mistake, though. It's actually a historical footprint. Each one of those pronunciations tells us a different story about where the word came from. And if you think that's wild, get a load of this. This is a classic puzzle that just perfectly illustrates how absurd it can all seem. If you take the GH sound from enough, the O sound from women, and the T sound from nation, you could logically argue that GHOTI spells fish. It's a perfect example of how inconsistent the rules feel. So, what about the rules we all learned in school? I before E except after C? Well, it turns out it's pretty much useless. There are something like 900 exceptions to that rule. 900! Words like way, neighbor, counterfeit, the list just goes on and on. It's so unreliable that the British school system apparently doesn't even bother teaching it anymore. So the so-called rules are broken from the start. Okay, so if the rules are no help, where do we find the real answer? Well, it's not in grammar books, it's in history. And here's the best way to think about it. English spelling isn't a single system. It's more like a painting, created over hundreds of years, with new layers constantly being slapped right on top of the old ones. And Duolingo actually puts it perfectly here. The spelling system we have today wasn't designed by a committee. It was built up over time, piece by piece. Different people, in different eras, all added their own little touches, creating this complex, and sometimes contradictory, masterpiece. So let's break down how this painting got made. It really comes down to 3 main layers. First, you've got the foundation, the Germanic roots of Old English. Then, in 1066, a huge layer of French got slathered on top after the Norman invasion. And finally, you have the modern era, where new technology and a massive change in how people talked turned everything on its head. Now, let's zoom in on that French layer, because this part is fascinating. When the French-speaking Normans became the ruling class in England, they brought thousands of their words with them. This created these weird pairs in the language. The Anglo-Saxon farmers, the ones actually raising the animals, kept using their old English words, cow, pig, chicken. But the French-speaking nobles who were eating the meat, they used their words, beef, pork, poultry. And you can still see that class divide in the vocabulary today. Okay, now for what is probably the biggest plot twist in this entire mystery. Sometime between the 1400s and 1700s, something huge happened to spoken English. Linguists call it the Great Vowel Shift. And to put it simply, the way people pronounced their vowels completely changed. But the spelling? Yeah, that pretty much stayed exactly the same. Let's look at our first piece of evidence for this shift. A very simple word we all know and use, boot. Hard to believe, right? But hundreds of years ago, the word boot was actually pronounced more like boat. Yeah, boat. The oo spelling made total sense for that long O sound. But then the Great Vowel Shift happened. People started saying boot, but nobody ever went back and updated the spelling, so the way we write it is literally a fossil of how that word used to sound. And it wasn't just the vowels that got weird. Let's dig into another clue. All those silent letters in a word like night. Those silent letters, they weren't always silent. Not at all. Back in Middle English, you would have actually pronounced the K at the beginning. And the GH wasn't silent either. It was this guttural sound from the back of your throat, kind of like the ch in the German name Bach. So night sounded way more like knischt. Over time, our pronunciation just kind of softened, and those sounds disappeared from speech. But they stayed in the spelling, like little ghosts of the past. So, you're probably wondering, if the way people talked was changing so much, why on earth didn't the spelling just change with it? Well, the answer comes down to one thing: technology. A single invention showed up and basically flash froze English spelling right where it was. The year is 1476. This is when a man named William Caxton brings the very first printing press to England. And this one event changes, well, pretty much everything. It meant that for the first time in history, you could standardize spelling and print books for the masses. And this is exactly where the great disconnect happens. The printers, they just took the spellings that were being used at the time, this messy, inconsistent jumble of history, and they locked them in. But, and this is the crucial part, while the written word was suddenly set in stone, the spoken word just kept right on evolving. And that's how we ended up with this massive gap between how English looks on a page and how it actually sounds. And then, to really cement the whole thing, the dictionary writers showed up. You had scholars like Samuel Johnson in Britain and later Noah Webster in America who set out to create an official version of the language. Webster especially wanted to create a distinctly American English, which is why we have differences like color versus color. So they weren't fixing the chaos, they were just making it official and creating different standards for it. So, we've followed the clues, we've gathered the evidence, and what have we found? The big reveal is that English spelling isn't broken or wrong. It's a living museum. Every strange spelling, every silent letter is an artifact, an exhibit with its own unique story to tell. It's really just a collage of its own history. You have the Germanic foundation, then a huge layer of French and Latin, then the Great Vowel Shift came along and shook everything up, then the printing press froze it all in time, and on top of all that, we've just kept borrowing words from all over the world, like cappuccino, samurai, tortilla, and bazaar, and each one of them brought its own spelling rules to the party. This quote really just says it all, doesn't it? When you're reading an English word, you're not just reading letters. You're reading a summary of centuries of invasions, migrations, technological revolutions, and cultural exchanges. It's a history book in itself. And that is the ultimate key. Once you stop looking for simple, perfect rules and you start seeing the story behind the words, the frustration really does start to fade. It becomes less about memorizing a million exceptions and more about understanding a really fascinating story. So I'll leave you with this thought. Now that you know the story behind the chaos, does it change how you see the language? Does it feel less like a series of mistakes and more like a rich, complicated, and amazing record of human history?